when we're living in Christ, despite the circumstances that we may be experiencing at the moment. We have joy because of Christ. And so Philippians chapter 3, beginning in verse 12, says, "Not that I have already obtained it or have already become perfect," and that word perfect means mature. "Not that I've already become perfect, but I press on so that I may lay hold of that for which also I was laid hold of by Christ Jesus. Brethren, I do not regard myself as having laid hold of it yet, but one thing I do, forgetting what lies behind and reaching forward to what lies ahead, I press on toward the goal for the prize of the upward call of God in Christ Jesus. Let us therefore, as many as are perfect or mature, have this attitude, and if anything you have a different attitude, God will reveal that also to you. However, let us keep living by that same standard to which we have attained." I think it's safe to say that we live in a sports-crazy culture. Would you agree with that? There are all kinds of ways to prove that case, but I think one of the easiest ways to prove that is the number of people who watch sports on television. Do you know that the number 2 all-time television broadcast, as far as people who watched, was last year's Super Bowl? 123 million people. 123 million people watched last year's Super Bowl. The only event in history that more people watched on television was the Apollo 11 moon landing. Now, that was a pretty significant event, wasn't it? That's the only thing that more people watched than last year's Super Bowl. We are kind of sports crazy today, and that's okay. If Paul were alive today, I have no doubt that he would have watched the Super Bowl last year. Paul, I think, by reading what he wrote to us, understood sports and athletics, and he was attracted to that. He was a sports fan. People in Paul's day, in the first century, were sports crazy too. First century Romans loved their sports. Athletes were the iconic figures and the heroes then, like they are in many cases today. And Paul was a sports fan, I have no doubt, because he used all kinds of analogies and illustrations and language from the world of athletics. For example, he talked to us about training ourselves spiritually like an athlete trains his body. He talked about boxing and how we have to fight the good fight. He talked about having self-control like an athlete. He talked about playing according to the rules of the game like an athlete has to. And today in this text, he used his most common analogy about the Christian life when he talked about a runner running a race. That's the analogy of the passage that we're looking at this morning. The analogy is the Christian life is a race, and we are runners. That's the picture here that Paul wants us to fix in our mind as we think about spiritual things. If you are a Christian, you are running a race this morning. You're running a race. And our spiritual growth is like that race. It has a starting line. That's when you repented and believed in Jesus. That's when you started in the race. It has a finish line. That's when you see Jesus again someday. And in between, we exert ourselves. We work hard and we strain and we struggle to finish the race of spiritual growth. And so it's a very simple picture that he gives us here when he talks about our spiritual growth. And so I want to take these verses and make some very simple statements about our own spiritual growth. Okay? Here's number one. This is your outline. We need to be realistic about our own spiritual condition. We need to be realistic about our own spiritual condition. And before I jump into that, I want to make sure you understand that Paul in these verses is not talking about how a lost person comes to faith in Jesus. That's not the analogy. He's talking solely to people who already know Jesus. These people are those who have repented and trusted Jesus as their only hope of being saved. So Paul's not talking about a lost person being saved. He's talking about how a saved person grows in the faith, right? These people he's reaching to have trusted Jesus, and here's how they can become more like Jesus. And so in theology terms, if you were a theologian, we're not talking about justification, how a person is made right in the sight of God. We're talking about sanctification, how somebody grows as a Christian, right? So that's the idea here. So I don't want you to go away thinking in any way that if we just work hard enough and exert ourselves and put out maximum energy and effort, then we can someday be saved. That is not the analogy. Our salvation, watch this, is God working in us to draw us to Jesus. God working. Our spiritual growth is us working to become more like Jesus. And this is what we're talking about, the latter and not the former, so don't confuse the two. And the way we talk about spiritual growth is to start with this. We have to be realistic about our spiritual condition. We have to come to grips and evaluate where we are spiritually in the race. And before we decide that about ourselves, it would help us if we see what Paul concluded about himself, right? If we really want to be accurate in how we view ourselves spiritually, let's see how Paul viewed himself. Go back to verse number 12 and the first phrase of that verse. He said, "Not that I have already obtained it or have already become mature or perfect." Paul's telling us his most accurate assessment of his own spiritual condition. What would Paul say about himself? What does Paul say about himself spiritually? Shockingly, he says, "I'm not there yet. I've still got work to do. I'm not where I need to be." He said, in this process of spiritual growth, I've still got a long way to go. I am not where I need to be yet. I'm in the race, and I'm not at the starting line anymore, but I haven't reached the finish line yet either. Do you see that in verse 12? I haven't already obtained it. I'm not already perfect or spiritually mature. Paul said, I'm not like Jesus in every way that I need to be. I'm not like Jesus in every case, in the way I talk, in the way I act, in the way I love, in the way I forgive, in the way I react to people. I'm not like Jesus in all of those ways, consistency like I know that I need to be. I'm not there yet. And that's Paul, right? Paul that most would regard as the most dedicated and surrendered Christian who's ever been a Christian, right? Paul. And he's not just starting out. He's no novice in the race. This is not 6 months after he becomes a follower of Jesus, or even 6 years. Bible scholars say that this was probably 20 years after he came to faith in Jesus. Paul would say, thank the Lord, I'm not what I once was, but I'm not what I need to be either. How humbling is that for us, right? If we ever want to get on our spiritual high horse and think more highly of ourselves than we ought to, we just need to go back and think about what Paul said about himself. I'm not there yet. By the way, you might remember that some years later, even more on his journey, Paul would say of himself, I'm the chief of sinners. I'm the chief of sinners. And this is not false modesty on Paul's part. He's not saying, false modesty when you see it, right? Somebody who's really good at something and they claim, well, I'm not very good at it. Right? False modesty. This is not that. This is what one writer calls holy dissatisfaction. I like that term, don't you? Holy. Paul had a holy dissatisfaction with himself. He was totally satisfied in Jesus and what Jesus had done for him, but he was dissatisfied in his own spiritual growth process. That's a good place for us to be. Holy dissatisfaction. We are satisfied in Jesus and what He's done for us, and we know He can never do anything else for us that He hasn't already done. I am satisfied with Jesus and I don't need anything else, but I am wholly dissatisfied with myself. And the key for us is not comparing ourselves to other people in the race. That's what you have to guard against, because we have that tendency, don't we? If we're in this race, and I believe you understand that, when we start thinking about where we are in the race, you know what we immediately start doing? Looking for somebody that's behind us. And we think, you know what, I'm ahead of that person. I'm not as good as that one up there, but I'm sure far ahead of this one back here. And we feel pretty good about ourselves, don't we? Right? Listen, in the race of spiritual growth, you can always find somebody slower than you are. You can always find somebody with more problems than you have. You can always find somebody with more issues than the issues that you have. And you can feel pretty good. But that's not how we do it. See, watch me. Our standard is not other runners in the race. What is our standard? It's Jesus, right? And in Jesus, we find this holy dissatisfaction. I'm not like Jesus in every way like I ought to be. That's what Paul did. That's what Paul did. What should my attitude be? I thank God that I'm not what I used to be spiritually. I'm saved now. I've got spiritual life. But I realize I'm not what I need to be yet. I have a holy dissatisfaction. So we have to start by being realistic. Now, I'm not saying always be down on yourself and poor mouth. I'm not saying that. I'm just saying be realistic. Don't ever get to thinking that we're at the finish line yet, right? Because we're not there yet. Here's the second thing I want you to take from these verses, and that's this. Be determined to make progress. Right? We don't just quit when we figure out that we're not where we need to be. We have to be determined to make progress. So the first part of verse 12, look at it. Not that I've already obtained it or I'm already perfect. The first part tells us where we are. The last part of verse 12 tells us where we're going. Look at the last part of verse 12. But I press on, so that I may lay hold of that for which I was laid hold of by Jesus. Now that's a quirky way to put that sentence, and I'll explain it in just a little bit. So the first part says you're not where you need to be. And at that point, it would be easy for us to say, well, you know what, I'm just going to give up. I've been working at this for 20 years. I've been a Christian for 40 years, and I don't feel like I've made very much progress. The point is not to give up because of how realistic we are about where we are. The point is keep pressing on. Right? Keep moving forward. No, I'm not where I need to be, but I'm not going to quit. I'm going to keep pushing. That's what Paul said in verse 12. I'm not there already, but I press on. I keep moving forward. I'm not content, so I'm moving in the right direction. So if we're in a race, a foot race, the implication is that we're moving and we're making progress toward the goal. If you're running a race, a 5K or 100-yard dash or whatever, if you stop, you're no longer making progress. The key is to keep moving toward the goal. We're not where we need to be. None of us are. We still fail. We struggle with some of the same old sins that we've struggled with our whole life. Are you with me? We mess up. We don't feel like we're maturing fast enough. But we don't get frustrated, and we don't quit, and we don't throw in the towel. We keep moving toward the goal. Listen, Christian, God's expectation is not perfection, it's progress, right? It's not perfection, it's progress. And it's not perfection, it's direction. Are you making progress in the right direction, Christian? That's the question. The question for you and for me today is not have you arrived. The question is, are you moving in the right direction? Right? That's what God wants to see. Not are you there yet, because we're never going to be there, but are you further along than you were back then? Are you further along toward the finish line than you were this time last year, and this time 5 years ago, and 10 years ago, and right after you became a Christian? Am I moving forward and making progress? Now, what's the goal? If we're running a race, this analogy, what's the finish line? What's our point out there that we're shooting for? Well, the last part of that quirky verse, right? He says, I'm pressing on to lay hold of that for which I was laid hold of by Jesus. Paul says, look, I'm trying to get to where God wants me to be and the reason He saved me. God saved me for a purpose. God saved me. He laid hold of me. That's what that means. He laid hold of me for a reason. Now, here's the reason. Watch me, church. The reason God saved Paul and the reason God saves us is to make us like Jesus, right? Romans 8:29 talks about we were chosen by God to be conformed to the image of His Son. Why did Jesus save me? Why did God save me? To make me like Jesus. Eventually. Steadily. Gradually. Why did God save you? Same reason. To make you eventually be just like Jesus. Paul said, I'm pressing on to grab a hold of that thing for which God grabbed a hold of me. I'm trying to be more like Jesus. That's the goal. When he said, I'm pressing on. I'm pressing on. In fact, look at that word again. He said, I press on so that I can be mature. The word press on is very important. Here's somebody's definition of it. I think it captures it. Press on means to move decisively toward an objective. To move decisively toward an objective. Paul says, look, that's the goal, that's the finish line. Watch this. And I choose to move in that direction. To move decisively toward an objective. My point in this emphasis is, now hear me, spiritual maturity for you and for me is a choice. It's a decision. It is an intentional move on our part. Paul says, I'm pressing on. Will you press on with me? To press on means to decide to go toward the goal. Spiritual growth, in order for it to happen, is a decision on your part. On your part. Can I be blunt? Yes, I can. The reason most of us as Christians don't grow spiritually is because we don't want to. That's pretty blunt, isn't it? And I didn't get any amens, and that's okay, right? I don't get a lot anyway. The reason you and I are not more mature. When Paul says, I'm pressing on, he says, I'm deciding, I'm making the choice right now. Growth is if we decide to grow. If we get up one day and say, you know what, no matter what happens today, I am taking steps intentionally to move in the direction of spiritual growth. You know why you're not more mature now than you were a year ago and 5 years ago? It's because you haven't decided to be. You know the reason why I still struggle with the same old things that I struggled with 5 years ago? Because I haven't decided to leave those things behind. You know why I'm not more like Jesus now than I should be? Because I haven't decided to. That's blunt, but it's the truth, right? It's the truth for all of us. If you're not where you think you ought to be and want to be, it's because you haven't decided to be. God's not at fault, right? I'm at fault, and you're at fault. We know what it takes, but we choose to stay where we are. Spiritual growth is a decision. It's a decision. We must decide to do the things necessary to grow. I have conversation with the people. You know, Pastor, I just don't feel like I'm growing very much. I just don't feel like I'm growing very, very much spiritually. And I say, well, are you consistently spending time in the Word? Well, I just got to get up early in the morning. I'm just not a morning person. I'm busy. Well, are you spending time in prayer? Well, I just struggle with prayer. Or are you consistent in worship? Are you corporate worship? Well, I got ball and all that. And you know what they're saying is, and we all do this, I'm not decided to grow. That's the problem. I haven't decided to do the things necessary to grow. Most of us, instead of having holy dissatisfaction, we have worldly satisfaction with the way things are. So we have to decide to make progress. Here's the third thing. You got those two already? Did you write them down? Here's the third thing. We have to be willing to forget the past. We have to be willing to forget the past. One thing you cannot do in a race is look behind you. One thing you cannot do in a race is look behind you. Look at verse 13. Paul said, Brethren, I do not regard myself as laying hold of it yet, but one thing I do, forgetting what lies behind and reaching forward. Paul says it is imperative that you not look over your shoulder as you're running the race. Think about a race that we might run. If you're going to run effectively and as well as you can't be looking over your shoulder at what is behind you. Now, I'm not a runner. You can tell that by looking at me. But I know this about racing. You can't move very fast if you're constantly looking backwards, right? You're not going to make progress forward if you're constantly looking over your shoulder at what is behind you. Looking at the past only impedes our forward progress. Let me say that again. I'm talking about spiritual things now, okay? Looking at the past only impedes our forward progress. Now, obviously, Paul is not saying that we ought to forget about all the blessings that God has given to us and how He's been gracious to us and He saved us in Christ. And we ought not think about it. That's not this. We ought to think about those things and be thankful for those things. But he's saying that a lot of stuff in our past is only going to slow us down as we're running, right? A lot of stuff in our past will only slow us down and get us off course. Ask any runner what happens if they get caught up looking behind them. Spiritually speaking, that can happen. Here's how that kind of shows up, spiritually speaking, right, if we look in the past. For one thing, we can try to live off yesterday's progress. If we're constantly content with what God has done in the past, and we're only thinking about how we grew at some point in the past and how we made progress and how we used to do some spiritual good things back then, and we kind of rest on that, rest on our past laurels, then we're not going to make progress in the future, right? You cannot, watch me, you cannot live spiritually off of things that happened in the past. You have to keep moving forward toward the goal. If your spiritual experience is wrapped up in something that happened 10 years ago, if your spiritual life, the pinnacle of that was 15 years ago or 30 years ago, something is wrong. You cannot constantly live in the past trying to make progress into the future. It's not good. Again, sports, right? If you win a game on Friday night and you're still thinking about that game that you won on Friday the next Wednesday, chances are you're not going to win the next game, right? Well, what did Coach Saban talk about? The 24-hour rule, right? Whether you win or lose in 24 hours, that game was gone. Didn't matter what it was or how important it was. Then you're thinking about the next game. You can't live off, spiritually, you can't live off yesterday's successes. Another way this manifests itself is you can't let the bitterness of the past slow us down. Look, there are bad things that happen. There are painful, hurtful things that happen in the church, right? I understand that. I get that. But if we choose to hang on to those things and rekindle the memory of those things constantly and relive those things, we're not going to make any progress. You understand what I'm saying? Something hurtful that took place 25 years ago should have zero bearing on your spiritual progress now. You cannot let something painful, negative that happened in the past slow you down now. You just can't. You cannot have a fixation on the past if you're trying to make progress. Have you ever seen those weights? They have like Velcro straps and you put them on your ankles and you work out with them, right? It's supposed to build your strength and your stamina in your legs. Those are for training, but what they're not for is for the race, right? You don't see marathon runners or sprinters with weights around their ankles. That's kind of what negative, painful experiences in our past do, is we're trying to make progress that slows us down. Take the weights off, throw them away, forget about them. Ask God to take them from your mind. Don't just keep stoking those memories and keeping them alive. That kills the chance of spiritual progress. You can't move forward if you're always looking backward. Here's another reason to forget the past is that we can't expect the present to be the same as the past. We can't expect the present going forward to be the same as the past. We like to talk about the good old days in the church, and I do that too. In our lives spiritually, the good old days. Well, back then, we think just because things are different now that they're less than they were back then, and that's not always the case. Just because things are different doesn't mean that they're less. Doesn't mean that they're not as good. The good old days were good, but they're in the past and we can't live on those things any longer. Things can be different than the past without being less than the past. I told somebody not long ago that I've been here what will soon be 22 years, and I figure that I have pastored at least 3 different churches in those 22 years. There's at least 3 different churches that I can identify as time has gone on, and each of those churches was different than the one before it, right? Because things change, and people change, and things move forward. And just because we move forward doesn't mean that wasn't good, and just because it's different now does not mean that this was not good. It's just different, right? Our church has changed a lot in the last 5 years. And if you think about those 5 years, it's pretty obvious why. We suffered a lot of losses, and those losses are still painful to us. But we've also made some progress. We've also improved in some things, and things are just different. Just because they're different doesn't mean they're not as good. So my point again, not to cast aspersions on the past, not that we don't honor the past, is that we just can't live in the past. Paul says, I'm pressing on, leaving the past behind, whether it's positive or negative, right? That's the key to spiritual growth. You can't move forward if you're always looking backwards. Here's the 4th thing. Be focused on the goal. Be focused on the goal. One of the keys to Paul's spiritual growth is that he was focused. He's what we would call single-minded, right? He had identified the most important thing as far as spiritual growth, and he made that his goal. He focused on that. In our racing analogy, that means that you fix your concentration on the finish line. You don't look around. You don't look up. You don't look behind you. You don't look in the stands. You're focused on the finish line. You're focused on the goal. Look back at verse 13. What a phrase this is. He says, one thing I do. He says, I got all this going on in the past and I got things in front of me, but one thing I'm concentrating on now, and that is pressing on toward being like Jesus. One thing. Paul had an intense focus on the goal of being like Jesus. It was his number one priority in life, and he would not be thrown off course. He would not let the past throw him off course. He would not let persecution and suffering throw him off course. He said, I got one thing in mind and one thing only, and that's being like Jesus. That was the finish line. That's all that mattered. There's a saying, maybe you've heard it. The main thing is to keep the main thing the main thing. Have you heard that one? It applies to a lot in life. The main thing is to keep the main thing the main thing. The main thing for Paul was becoming more like Jesus every day. The main thing for us as we live our life and run our race is to become more like Jesus every day. That doesn't mean we quit our jobs and go on the mission field or become a pastor. It means as we're doing life that God's called us to, we take every opportunity to grow and become more like Jesus. The main thing is the main thing, and we got to keep it the main thing. Somebody said Paul was like this heat-seeking missile, right? And he had identified the target, and he was focused on it. So if you're going to grow, if I'm going to grow, we got to make spiritual growth our goal. We got to make it our priority. We got to focus on it. We cannot let the things of the world distract us. Yes, we're in the world, and we participate in the things of the world that are not sin, but we keep our focus on being like Jesus. Everything else in the world has to take a back seat to being like Jesus. Concentrated focus. That's what we need. It's a powerful tool as we try to grow. Most successful people, hear me now, I'm going to move on. Most successful people in the world, whatever endeavor they're involved in, most successful people are focused people. You ever think about that? They figure out what the most important thing is, and they concentrate on that one thing. World-class athletes don't try to do 15 things moderately well. They zero on one thing, and they do it well. They do it the best, right? Business leaders who excel in the business world, they don't dabble in a bunch of different stuff. They focus on one thing, and they're intent on doing that well. John MacArthur said, "The world is full of people who are clever at much and successful at nothing because they never focus their life." They're clever at much, but they excel at nothing because they don't focus. D.L. Moody said, "Better to say this one thing I do than to say these 40 things I dabble in." Our calendar will always be full. Our lives will always be busy. The world is always pulling at us, wanting our attention, wanting our time, wanting our focus. Don't put Jesus on the back burner. Focus on Jesus. And then one more thing. Be prepared. You know, the favorite point of the sermon is the last one. Be prepared for hard work. Be prepared for hard work. A lot of Christians have this illusion that being a Christian is supposed to be easy, and that growing to be like Jesus is supposed to be natural and easy and not take effort and not take intent and not take focus. It's supposed to just come to us like osmosis, and it's easy. And that is not accurate. That is not true. If you're going to grow spiritually, it will take hard work. It's going to take hard work. Again, don't go out and misunderstand me. We don't work for our salvation. We don't work for God to save us. But once God saves us, we work to grow. And one of the things that Christians miss is that it doesn't just happen. It's not automatic. It takes hard work and exertion and intentionality. Look at the end of verse 13. Paul says, reaching forward. I'm not looking over my shoulder. As a matter of fact, he says, I am reaching forward toward the goal. And that idea, that reaching forward, it translates one word, and it's a very intense word from the sports world. It means, somebody said it means that the athlete throws himself forward in the race with all his energies strained to the very utmost. Paul used that word intentionally. Paul says, here I want you to picture spiritual growth as something that you have to strain at with every fiber of your being, and every muscle of your body is at peak performance. As a matter of fact, I put a picture. Let's see what it looks like. See that guy right there? That's the word Paul is talking about. Press on. Reaching forward. That's what he was talking about. That athlete, every fiber of his being is stretched out toward the goal. Every muscle is at full capacity. Paul says that's what it takes for us to grow spiritually. That's what it takes. We call them spiritual disciplines because it takes discipline to do them. It is not easy. It is not easy to consistently have a quiet time. It's not. Time alone, away from the world and the busyness of the world, the time that you spend with God, that is not easy. It is not easy to consistently spend time in the Word. Why? Because we're busy and the world demands a lot of us. It is not easy to make that happen. It is not easy to make corporate worship a priority for yourself and your family. It is not easy to turn away from habitual sin and frivolous worldly habits. It is not easy to find a place of service and start working and keep it up. It is not easy to develop those habits, but that is what's required if we're going to grow. Right there, straining. It's hard, I push through. It's difficult, I keep going. I'm tired, I keep at it. I'm sleepy, get up anyway. That's what Paul says it takes for us to grow spiritually. Most Christians are not prepared for the hard work it takes to grow and reach the finish line. They're just not willing to do it. So in the race, here's what we need to remember. This is what I've told you this morning. We need to evaluate where we are. Where are you? Well, we're not where we need to be. I'm in the race. I'm a follower of Jesus. Is that you? Is that you? I'm a follower of Jesus, so I'm off the finish line, but I haven't made the progress that I need to. But I'm determined to make progress. I'm going to keep moving in the right direction. I haven't gotten there yet, but I'm getting closer. And I'm not going to look behind me. I'm not going to let something that happened in the past slow me down and be like a weight on my ankle. And I'm going to focus on the goal and make it a priority. And I'm going to be willing to do the hard work. And when it gets hard, I keep going. Is that you? How are you running the race this morning? Where are you? Are you just barely off the starting blocks? And you ought to be further along? Are you willing to do the work that it takes? Are you not focused on the goal, right? Church is just an afterthought, and Jesus is just an afterthought. And yeah, I know Jesus, and I know I'm going to heaven, but I got all this stuff going on, and when I fit Jesus in, I'll do that. You're not going to grow. You're not going to grow. You're going to stay right there at the starting blocks, right? I want you to stand with me this morning. And I just want you to evaluate where you are as the music plays and as our heads are bowed and eyes are closed. And if you're just honest with yourself, what would you say about your spiritual condition, where you are in the race? Pastor, I'd agree with you. I'm not where I need to be, but I've kind of given up. I'm not even trying. Well, today's the day you can start back up again. You can start. Progress might be slow. You might not go as fast as you think you should. But as long as you're moving and making progress in the right direction. Pastor, I've let the things of the world grab my attention, and I'm no longer focused on the goal like I should be. I've got all this going on, and it's good stuff, but I've put it number one in my life, and I put Jesus down here about number 4 or 5. You need to repent of that. You need to ask God to help you. Is that you? Where do you fall in this? I'm going to ask God to work in our hearts. God, would you do something this morning? Convict us and show us where we are. Help us to be honest in our evaluation. Help us, Father, decide to do the things necessary to grow more like Jesus. Father, as we wait, would you call some this morning to make a decision for you? I'm going to wait here. Maybe you need to come. Maybe there's something that God's called you to today or last week or the several weeks before. You need to make that decision this morning. Maybe you've been part of this fellowship and this worship, but you're not officially connected, and you need that accountability and responsibility as a church family, and you need to come for that today. Maybe you've never been saved. You're not even in the race. You're not still near the starting line. You're not even at the starting line. You realize today or the last few weeks that if you were to die, you'd have no hope of heaven and being right with God. You've been depending on your goodness and yourself. You've been depending on the wrong things. You need to be saved today. I'm calling you to do what God says. Decide now. Decide now.